Good afternoon, everyone. We will
Bon
just
après-midi à
start.
tous et à toutes.
We will just give it a minute and start. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for our side event, Terrorizing Human Rights Defenders, Counter-terrorism as a Tool of Repression in the MENA region. The event is organized by 15 local, regional, and international organizations in parallel to the ongoing 49th Human Rights Council session. My name is Nada Awad. I'm the International Advocacy Officer at the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, and I will moderate this event. Please note that you can listen to the event in English, French, and Arabic by activating the interpretation button at the bottom of the screen. Please send your questions using the Q&A function. We will take the questions at the end of the event. The alarming trend of using counter-terrorism legislation as a pretext to crack down on fundamental freedoms in the MENA region has far-reaching consequences on civic space and the capacity of civil society organizations to operate, as will be shown by the speakers who will provide concrete examples from their own personal experiences in Algeria, Egypt, Bahrain, and Palestine. These examples will illustrate the human rights costs of the misuse of counterterrorism, as the use of vague and overly broad legislations has facilitated the mischaracterization of independent and legitimate human rights work and led to the arrest of countless individuals over the years, including human rights defenders, activists, journalists, and lawyers on unfounded terrorism charges. In that regard, Professor Fionnuala Ni Aoulin, the Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms while Countering Terrorism, will share her perspective as a UN expert and address the work of her mandate. I will give the floor to our first speaker, Ms. Jamila Louqil, Algerian journalist and human rights defender, charged on 29 April 2021 with, I cite, enrollment in a terrorist or subversive organization. The case also includes 12 other activists involved in the Hirak protest movement. If convicted of this charge, they face up to life imprisonment or the death penalty, according to the law. Jamila, you have the floor.
Voilà, mesdames, messieurs, bonjour. Je tiens à vous
Ladies
remercier.
and gentlemen, good afternoon. I would like to thank you for your availability and for listening. I'm Jamila Louqil. I am guilty, according to the Algerian regime, to be a journalist and a defender of human rights in Algeria, and to be the wife of a human rights defender and a trade unionist, Ms. Qabdour Shwisha. First, I would like to underline that we have been under repression before the Hirak in 2019, this great movement of protest movement for democracy, which was applauded by throughout the world and which was very peaceful. However, this repression has taken another turn since our action was fell within Hirak. Myself, I have been arrested 4 times, 3 of which during when I went to file a complaint. My husband has been arrested 7 times. He has been the target of police violence and condemned to 1 year in jail on 9 December 2019. before being acquitted on 3 March 2020. Our son Adel has been also taken to police station and also worked on. On 28 April 2021, while we were coming out from the Oran court for a trial, we have been accused of threat to the public order and of non-armed designated as arbitrarily designated as terrorists. We have refused to answer the questions since we have filed complaints for police harassment, but these has been unanswered. The following day, on the 29th April 2021, we have been presented to we saw the public prosecutor who is in charge of terror in Iran, together with 13 other persons, including a journalist, Said Boudour, member of the Algerian League for Human Rights, has also been arrested violently on 23 April 2021 and was kept in custody. We have listened to by the public prosecutor and by the investigating magistrate, and we found ourselves that we were terrorist accusations have been leveled against us, such as plotting against the state security and inciting the citizens to take up the arms against the authority of the state and to threaten the territorial integrity together with propaganda likely to put to detrimental to the national interest. And also with enrolling with a terrorist organization, a subversive to Algeria by virtue of Articles 1787B, 87B3, 87B6, 87B12 of the Algerian Penal Code, in addition to other accusations which have become classical. The Human Rights Committee of the United Nations have already recommended to Algeria on 17 August 2018 the revision of Article 87B of the Penal Code on terror in order to define with precision the terrorist acts and to ensure that these provisions are not used to limit the rights, particularly of the human rights militants. For these accusations, we risk a life jail sentence or the capital death, which has never been suspended in Algeria. Of course, these recommendations have not been followed by the Algerian state. On the contrary, in June 2021, after our accusations, there have been modifications to Articles 87B of the Penal Code have been introduced, and this enlarging the scope of application and reinforcing the definition, the vague definition of what is a terrorist act. My husband and myself and other 7 people, probably thanks to the international visibility that we have had, we have been left free. Journalist Said Boudour and 2 other people have been placed under judiciary control, while 3 others have been detained for a short time while pending their appearance before a court in April. In September 2021, the investigating magistrate of Iran gave up the file to his colleague who specializes in the terror national affairs in the Sidi Mohammed in Algiers, which deals with all the terror cases in Algeria, and the case is still being investigated. we have to keep in mind that there is a escalating repression which touches thousands of Algerians, all young and old. And in a recent example of the case of Falah Hamoudi, who is responsible of a section of the Algerian League for Human Rights, and also a trade unionist, have been condemned to 3 years in jail on 20 February, last 20 February. For a year now, the demonstrations of Iraq have resumed in Algeria. The police violence and massive arrests and intimidations have been led firmly. And there have been so many Algerians that have been arrested or incarcerated, such as Abdelraouf Arslan, 5 journalists, including Hassan Bourras, in detention since September, and trade unionists. 9 other members of the Algerian League of Human Rights have also been accused of terror, and other the human rights defender militant Amazir Kamira Naidseed or Zaki Hannash, who risked 35 years in jail because of their work documenting violations of human rights. I would add that not only we fear for our lives, but also for our we are afraid, we are scared, but we also fear for our lives. Thank you.
Sorry, I was hearing the translation still going, so this is why.
Thank you so much.
I hope now that it's okay. All right. Maybe to ask the speakers to speak a little bit slower for translation. Thank you. I want to thank Jamila for this important testimony. Her case is symbolic, but it is one of many. In Algeria, we have documented at least 59 individuals arbitrarily arrested and prosecuted on bogus terrorism charges between April and October 2021. 43 of them are in pretrial detention. I would like to recall that during the ongoing Human Rights Council session, the High Commissioner reiterated concerns regarding increased restrictions on fundamental freedoms, including an increase in arrests and detention of human rights defenders, civil society members, and political opponents. She called on the authorities to take all necessary steps to guarantee its people's right to freedom of speech, association, and peaceful assembly. I will now turn to Mr. Rami Shat, Egyptian-Palestinian political activist and human rights defender, a leading figure in the 2011 Arab Spring pro-democracy movement. For 2.5 years, Rami was a prisoner of conscience in Egypt. At the time, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention issued an opinion finding that his arrest was arbitrary, and UN experts urged authorities to remove him from the terror list and to stop the systematic misuse of terrorism. Rami, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nada. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I was released 8 weeks ago after 2.5 years of jail, some of it in solitary confinements of underground, and some of it in major cells with tens of people mounted between 18 to 32. I was arrested for 2.5 years under quote-unquote terrorism charges, and I was put under investigation, in which I was investigated through the 2.5 years once by special prosecutors of the security, asking me for 45 minutes about my opinion of who did I voted for and what was my opinion about the revolution in 2011. And that with them was the terrorist charges. At the end of those 45 minutes, the only 45 minutes I was interrogated through, the guy told me that you are accused of being part of a terrorist organization. And I asked, what terrorist organization? He said, well, we cannot tell you the name. And secondly, you are charged of spreading rumors and lies against the state using social media networks. And I said, I'm a well-known activist for many years, and people make fun of me because I don't have any social media networks. I don't even have a Facebook account. He said, well, that is the charges in front of me. You can say no to that. And I did say no. Okay, sign here. And from that, my renewal of my jail sentence went on for 2.5 years, for 900 days, and not till a major international pressure that allowed my departure 900 days later. Yes, 9 months into my jail, they called me in and asked me to show in front of camera that I'm getting medical treatment. And in jails, in Egyptian jails, especially for political prisoners, people don't get any medical treatment. And I refused to show in front of TV, to giving them the lie and the show that they are giving medical treatment. And they got very angry that I refused to make this show for them. 2 weeks later, I heard in the newspaper that I was accused in another case while in jail. And in that case, the court sentenced me to be part of the terrorist list. So I became a member of the terrorist list of Egypt without even investigating me or interrogating me or taking me to court while I was in jail by then, as a retribution for my refusal to give them a propaganda show inside jail. And I was added with other friends, including Ziad Al-Alaimi, who is a well-known parliamentarian and a parliament member. Yes, for 2.5 years, I went 10 times to prosecutor's office, 20 times to a judge in extremely shameful regulations and shameful procedures with absolutely no regard of the law. I was accused based on nothing. There was no real accusations. There was no evidence. There was no testimonies. There was only a document by a security officer giving me an accusation, and that was enough to throw me in jail for 2.5 years. On those 2.5 years, I definitely have seen many politicians, party members, heads of parties and deputies of parties. I've seen human rights defenders. I've seen a lot of journalists, and I've seen lawyers. Some of them were lawyers defending me in my first show in the prosecutor's office. Days later or weeks later, they were arrested and thrown next to me in my jail because it is not allowed to defend terrorists and not allowed to defend opposition members. Definitely bloggers and writers. But in addition to activists in many political or human rights issues, I have seen thousands of people that were just arbitrarily detained because an officer stopped them in the street and confiscated their phone and checked their mobile number or Facebook account and found a comment or a joke, and sometimes a like to a comment or a joke was enough to be sentenced and thrown as a terrorist. Sometimes I've seen people, I've seen cases of a taxi driver who was waiting in the street talking to his friends about the increase of oil and how is that affecting his business, and he was overheard and he was taken and thrown in jail as a terrorist. 60,000 Egyptian prisoners, I have seen thousands of them during my jail time. None of them have committed any foul play or any violent crime. All of them were prosecuted and jailed because of their political beliefs or expression of their opinions. Yes, the Egyptian government, unfortunately, are using the arbitrary detention, the exceptional court, the special security prosecutors where you have absolutely no rights, forced disappearance and systematic torture, killing outside the law, freezing of your assets and preventing you from traveling, adding to unhuman conditions that political prisoners go through in jail. And that is part of the treatment and part of the punishment political prisoners get is by giving them unhuman treatments and unhuman living conditions while being in jail arbitrarily in every way. Yes, in Egypt, unfortunately, this has been used against opposition. It's been used against to spread fear among the people, to prevent them from moving, to prevent them from asking for their basic rights, to continue the regime's power and to continue their military power over the country that led today, under the counter-terrorism law, 60,000 people to be incarcerated and in jails unrightly or unjustly. For Egypt, we've lived for tens of years under the emergency law. But today, the Egyptian government found its catch in the terrorist law. You don't need anymore an emergency law. You can use the same laws and the same arbitrary ways of arresting people and the same disregard of human values or judicial procedures by using a counter-terrorism law in which you arrest your opposition in every way and prosecute people for their right and for their right to express themselves. Yes, I've seen libraries being shut. I've seen institutions being shut, NGOs being beaten and taken their money and thrown in jail. I've seen parties not allowed to have an event. And this is all under the terrorism law or under the quote unquote issue with terrorism. Unfortunately, while in terrorism, counter-terrorism by default around the world infringes on your civil rights and on your civil liberty, in Egypt, it's an absolute lie. The whole idea of terrorism is only used against opposition, against human rights defenders, against journalists, against people who speak their mind. And yes, this has a major effect on human rights in Egypt, but also it has a major effect on counterterrorism. Egypt has relations with most of the services around the world, and they cooperate and they exchange information about terrorists. And the lists Egypt sends to its counterparts around the world are a basic lie. Our list of opposition groups, our list of party members, our list of people arbitrarily detained. So yes, what is happening under the name of terrorism not only affects human rights in Egypt and destroy the basic rights of people to live and express themselves, but also destroys counterterrorism and the international cooperation for counterterrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this important testimony, which clearly shows that international pressure is essential to ensure the release of arbitrarily detained individuals. I would like to recall that on the 12th of March 2021, 31 states at the Human Rights Council urged Egypt to end its persecution of activists, journalists, and political opponents, and called on Egypt to release them unconditionally. A year later, Egypt failed to respond to these calls. I will now turn to Mr. Sayed Al-Wadi'i, Director of the Advocacy at the Bahraini Institute for Rights and Democracy. Sayed is a Bahraini human rights defender who, after facing persecution and imprisonment in Bahrain for his participation in the 2011 Arab Spring pro-democracy movement, co-founded Bird in London, where he now lives in exile. Sayed, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Nada, and it's such a difficult job to speak after Rami and Jamila. Thank you so much for your contribution. It's really heartening to hear such a treatment you've been going through. Sadly, the situation in Bahrain doesn't really vary much from what we have heard. I had a first-hand experience of being horrifically abused by the security police, whether it's during a protest or whether it's after speaking out because I was assaulted. I was thrown in prison, interrogated, tortured, and spent 6 months. And that was the reason for me to flee the country. I thought leaving Bahrain and carrying on a human rights activism or work from London will be an end of direct and personal attack. Only to figure out it's just because of carrying out activities like attending the Human Rights Council sessions, meeting with the UN Special Rapporteurs, just the normal activities that any human rights defender or activist would do. I was subjected to an act that was not through a judicial process or anything. One day, I woke up and I saw Bahrain published a list of names. This was 72 individuals were named to be revoked of their citizenship. Just by scrolling this, I saw my name was listed number 5. And if, fortunately, my name was there on this list. It means I'm no longer Bahraini. And if I don't have any other citizenship, it means I'm effectively a stateless individual. To this date, I am a stateless individual. It's not something that I was even understanding the term of it in 2011 when, sorry, before things like this really I experienced personally. I thought this is maybe the extent that Bahrain could take, and they would obviously use what we would call terrorism charges. There is no charges in this case. There is nothing. There is just a decision to say those which undermine the public security, they deserve to be having their right to be taken away from them. And that was the start of it. But another event has really changed the way I think about the regime and the extent they could take it to. And this was an event, unfortunately, where the closest who are to me, they the one which were impacted the most. And in this instant, in London, the King of Bahrain was visiting Theresa May, the then Prime Minister. And as his vehicle enters in Downing Street, I thrown myself at his car, and I shouted against a dictator that was responsible for my torture. Few hours later, my wife and my infant son at that time was stopped at the Bahrain airport. My 18-month son was taken away by force from his mother's hand. She was dragged on the floor in the airport and then interrogated for 7 hours. And they said to her, "Where would you like us to start? From your family or from his family?" It was only the fact that the king was still in London and having headlines and news outlets like the Sunday Times stating Bahrain's terrorizing refugee family, that what really got them out of the prison. It is hard to talk about the anti-terrorism charges when I just remember number of inmates that I shared cell with at Jawa prison back in 2011. Some of them remain to be arbitrarily detained. Some of them are really heroic human rights defenders. They the one really inspire generations of human rights activists. One of those two names are very dear to my heart. One of them is Abdul Hadi al-Khawaja. Probably he would be considered the godfather of having human rights activism within the Gulf region, and was one of those voices, one of those individuals that we would admire whenever we hear him talking about the situation in Bahrain or about the human rights situation. Another dear teacher and a professor, Dr. Abdul Jalil Senghis, a man who was disabled by birth. He spoke about probably one of the most harrowing testimonies I heard in Bahrain, within Bahrain context, because it was really sad to see someone, they would abuse him because he is disabled. So someone to insult him to curse him because he is disabled. And one guy was telling him, "I wanted to rape you, but I don't because you are disabled." This is the sort of treatment this man being subjected to. A distinguished professor within Bahrain University. At once, he was the head of mechanical engineering. And if there is something Bahrain would be proud of, is just to have academics like him to be not only educating and teaching generations, but also to be raising the issue of human rights and to challenge the state when they have to. As Senghis, sadly, is someone who has started a hunger strike since 8th of July last year. We're talking about more than 8 months. And this man did not have solid food, and he's starving himself, to tell the world that there is a boundary that will tolerate abuse within this prison. I'm not going to take it further. And the way that I wanted to tell the world that this Bahrain's behavior, to take away my notes, my research, where he spent 4 years, my handwriting, all of those things, just to be taken away arbitrarily, this is something he would not tolerate. And he said he was going to continue his hunger strike until those are returned to his family. And they are about Bahrain culture. They're not a threat, they're not a political constitution or something that they would change the regime. They just simply notes about the Bahraini dialect and so on. So we did pay tribute to individuals, to the sacrifice individuals like Senghis would give to this context. But the use of terrorism in Bahrain and this act, or like when they say terrorism, this can go to children. Last year, children as young as 11, 13 years old, I interviewed some of them. They were interrogated, abused, threatened by rape, threatened by electrocution, under what they call it terrorism charges and so on. Death penalty is another thing that is thematic within Bahrain. I have personally spoke to death row inmates, and their experience is another level. Like, frankly, like I couldn't imagine individuals not only to go through the solitary confinement, but it's the fact that they would be abused through a very long period. They would be stripped naked. They would apply electric shocks on them. Sometimes when I spoke to some of those people and they tell me their harrowing experience, I just think, pause, how could they still like stand up or speak or like providing what they really going through? And this is like individuals, their courage is like Muhammad Ramadan. And this is Muhammad Ramadan is on death row. April last year or June last year, the UN working group has called for his release, and he's to be compensated and so on. I remember Muhammad Ramadan was telling me a really important message. He said, I would like you to send this message to the world, to New York Times, to the Washington Post, to everyone, just to tell them before my prosecution that I am innocent person and I will be subjected to death, and I will go through this, what they call it, court, in order to secure death sentence against me. I am not a famous person, neither I have a lot of money, but I have been subjected to this severe injustice. Muhammad Ramadan message was indeed reported in New York Times, but later only to have the world champion Lewis Hamilton, Formula One champion, was stating, I would like to support the Muhammad case because only his son asked Lewis Hamilton to support his father and wrote about this issue. So sometimes international pressure can work, but it has to have something which is important, that the courage of these individuals. And I think if I have one final point is about also like the extent of anti-terrorism law can apply to what we call it abuse of Interpol or international policing. Just in January this year, a Bahraini dissident was extradited from Serbia, despite a ruling by the European Court that he should not be extradited, and he was handed over there. Just a few weeks ago, he was assaulted by the police. This is really a real challenge. And if Bahrain is a rich country or like part of the Gulf, filthy rich countries, it should not be avoiding international scrutiny. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Sayed, for this important testimony and for highlighting these emblematic cases. I would like to reiterate that not only are individuals being followed and arrested on unfounded terrorism charges, but collective punishment is also a tool used to ensure that human rights defenders and activists are silenced. I would like to reiterate that 3 of Sayed's family members have been targeted with imprisonment in what the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention described as unlawful acts of reprisals. I would like now to turn to Ms. Sahar Francis, the Director of Al-Damir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, a Palestinian NGO providing legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in Israeli and Palestinian prisons since 2006. Al-Damir is one of the leading 6 Palestinian organizations designated as terrorists by Israel. Sahar, you have the floor.
Thank you, Nada, and it's really an honor to be sharing this panel with all of you, with Jamila, with Sayed, with Rami, and with Finolia. But it's really very touching to hear Sayed, Rami, and Jamila talking about their personal experiences. And it's really, it's not shocking for me, the similarities they were describing about the system and the undemocratic regimes manipulating anti-terror laws and security in order to violate basic human rights. The only shocking thing that these countries were considered under the international community as undemocratic countries, whether Algeria or Bahrain or Egypt. The irony here that in our context, Palestine, the whole international community deals with Israel as a democratic and maybe the only democracy in the Middle East. While I'm listening to the 3 of them and thinking about the procedures and the practices and the crimes committed by the state, it's the same. And it's coming from the same way of thinking about controlling the people and maintaining the control over the people. And this brings me to the case that I wanted to highlight today about the designation of the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations and the attack against human rights defenders It didn't, of course, it didn't started with the case of the 6 Palestinian organizations. Let's put it in the real context. Actually, Israel, since the first day of the creation of the state after Nakba in 1948, they immediately started to use the British security regulations. No one after the Second World War was talking about terrorism, but Israel started to use the British security regulations of 1945 in order to use this tool of oppression against political activists, against those who remained, against the Palestinian community who remained inside and became citizens of the state. This tool was illegalizing all political parties, Palestinian political parties, of course, where the reason for imprisonment of thousands of Palestinians inside the state of Israel. The same tool was implemented after the occupation of 1967 in the occupied territories and were incorporated as well in the military orders in order to enable the use of administrative detention that Rami was describing in the Egyptian experience, being arrested without any charge, without any trial for indefinite period, without being able to know when you would be released and how to defend yourself in order to be released. Much before the era of the anti-terror legislations, Israel was implementing these policies on the ground. It was just a privilege for them, all what happened in the international level after September 11th and all this legislation of anti-terror. Then they just managed to associate what they were doing decades before with the international development, and they were satisfied with how things developed, because then the security and the necessity and all these terms were also elaborated in the international level in the same way how the Israeli High Court and the military courts and the criminal system inside Israel were elaborating security and necessity and protection against Palestinian peoples. So what happened in the last couple of years after all these practices against the Palestinian people, it was developing in a way that it was so easy in this atmosphere of anti-terrorism in the international level that Israel starts to widen the attack to include human rights defenders and human rights organizations, civil society organizations. So it didn't started with our 6 cases, but it started much before when Israel started to declare about civil society organizations that they are illegal organizations, again, according to the military orders and the British security regulations that they enforce, because they were able to claim that these organizations are involved in money laundering for terrorist groups. Like, you should keep in mind that Israel declared about all Palestinian political parties as terrorist organizations, terrorist groups, Fatah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, DFLP. All the political parties are still declared illegal, even after the peace agreement with the PLO, with the Palestinians, all political parties. So it's very easy to associate you with any of these political parties in order to claim that you are a terrorist. So the cases and the trending cases currently, it's very important to highlight that much before our case as Damir and the other colleagues, the case of Mohammed Al-Halabi, the director of the World Vision Organization, an Australian organization that he was accused of being involved in money laundering with Hamas. Although the Australian investigation proved that there's no evidence for this, he's still 5 years awaiting trial in the Israeli court system. Shaza Audi and Khitam Saafin, 2 directors of 2 of the Palestinian Healthcare Committee and the Women Union Committees, they are still in detention because of their work in human rights. our colleague Salah Hamouri, that he was just arrested 2 days ago, and Salah is facing real persecution since 2011 when he was released after spending 7 years in Israeli prison. He's still harassed by administrative detention. They deported his wife, his French wife, back to France. They revoked his residency based on allegations last year. And today, 2 days ago, he was imprisoned, and we are expecting that he would be sent for administrative detention. In our case, as organizations, we were designated as terrorist organizations because of our work in defending human rights, in disclosing the Israeli war crimes and crimes against humanity, in the involvement with the UN system, human rights system, in the ICC, and all the work that we are trying to push. So it's really very important to see these similarities, to say it very clearly without real accountability coming from the UN system. For all perpetrators, for all those that they violate human rights systematically, the UN mechanism, human rights law and international human rights law and international humanitarian law will mean nothing for the oppressed people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sahal, for this important testimony. I would like to remind attendants that you can send your questions to the speakers in the Q&A function. And I will now turn to Ms. Fionnuala Ní Amhlainn, the Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights and fundamental freedoms while countering terrorism. Professor Ní Amhlainn will situate the examples provided by speakers within the broader regional and global trends of misuse of counterterrorism. Professor, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Nada. And thank you particularly to the Cairo Institute for Human Rights Studies, a long and distinguished organization with a long history of working on these issues in multiple ways for convening this timely event. And to each individual speaker for so courageously and so passionately shedding light on your own personal experiences and the challenges you and your families have faced in your respective country situations. I start by acknowledging that the mandate I hold, the mandate on counterterrorism and human rights, has been monitoring these developments with great concern. We have issued, as I think many of you know, multiple communications on several of the specific cases in the MENA region, including particularly with regard to the alleged arbitrary detention of my co-panelist, Rami, whom I'm very glad to see here today, and acknowledge also the significant work that was done by his extraordinary wife to ensure his release. So really important. We can't, I think, forget the enormous burden that families as well as individuals face in these contexts. I think we're also really clear about the challenges that human rights defenders are experiencing across the MENA region, including in Bahrain, Algeria, and Egypt. I also want to acknowledge and say very clearly that I and a number of special procedure mechanisms have issued a press release on Israel's and a communication on Israel's terrorist organization designation of the 6 Palestinian human rights organizations and the use of alleged Pegasus software on these organizations, including the staff of Adamir, which is represented by my co-panelist Sahar today. I've expressed deep concern about the effectively complete destruction of Palestinian civil society and the importance that that civil society infrastructure has played over many decades in the Palestinian context. And the existence of that Palestinian civil society has been essential to maintaining the case for the rule of law, the protection of human rights, and ultimately, of course, the peaceful resolution of an occupation and conflict. As I said to the US Congress when I gave evidence to the Lantos Commission earlier this autumn on this issue, civil society is the essential organ, the essential mechanism that not only enables a healthy and functional society, but is indispensable to the resolution of conflict. And when you attack civil society, you are attacking the possibility of peaceful resolution itself. I also want to acknowledge that we've issued communications on counterterrorism and NGO laws across the region. And we've also been particularly concerned about the use of countering terrorism finance measures to attack and to undermine the integrity and the work of civil society. I also do want to say that my mandate's role is also to engage constructively and consistently with states. And I have done so and will continue to engage constructively with these states on these particular cases, as well as the broader counterterrorism framework. It's that commitment and the understanding that states need to internalize that it is only when they engage in counterterrorism work in a human rights compliant way, as required by the Security Council under Chapter 7 resolutions, that we will see both the protection of human rights and the prevention of violence in many societies. But I think one of the points I want to particularly underscore as we move out from individual cases is to see the way in which these cases and these country situations are not one-off discrete incidents. As Special Rapporteur since 2017, as I took up this office, what I have seen and observed and documented and will continue to document is the rising tide and abuse of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism or simply extremism measures by states. And the evidence shows us overwhelmingly that what is happening is that these measures are being used not to crack down on terrorism, but effectively to crack down on civil society, on democracy advocates, on women human rights defenders, on those defending the environment, on journalists, on artists, on people who are simply seeking to engage in humanitarian action. And as I explained in my 2019 report to the Human Rights Council on Closing Civic Space, as we look at the last 20 years of the use of counterterrorism measures since 9/11, counterterrorism laws have proliferated dramatically. And at the same time, governments are adopting harsh regulation of civic space. And the two things are intimately connected. And in many ways, these laws, both the counterterrorism laws and the civil society restriction laws, are contemporaneous. They're doing the same thing. They're increasingly invoking administrative and other informal measures that seek to sidestep traditional consensus making and public consultations central to formal legislation or international legal regulation, vital to protect the conduct of public affairs. So a little bit to statistics, because often when states ask me what's the basis for my claims that civil society are at the heart center of the attacks that are being made on it by counterterrorism. And I think that the reality is that we have consistent evidence to demonstrate that this is the case. Since my mandate's inception, because we have tracked this diligently, since 2005, 66% of all relevant communications sent to governments by the mandate have related to the misuse and abuse of a counterterrorism measure against civil society. So let's be clear, this is lousy counterterrorism. It's also terrible for human rights. And what we see in that use and misuse is core and established freedoms, the right to freedom of association, the right to freedom of expression, the right to practice your religion, the right to participate in public affairs, the right not to be discriminated against, the right to have a fair public hearing. All of these are under mounting attack from counterterrorism across the globe. And let's be clear, none of this is making us safer. None of this is making us more secure. And what we hear, as we've heard today, is that civil society actors, the men and women who are at the front lines of civil society work, essentially safeguarding the most fundamentals of our rights, are the ones being subject to arbitrary detention and denied the most fundamental fair freedoms that we should have, including fair trial and due process. And so what I would say to you, and what we are seeing as we sit here in Geneva, is it's clear that states are all drawing from the same playbook. And Sahar, I think, made this point very, very passionately and importantly, and inspiring one another to do the same. And what we see is the playbook starts from an overly expansive and purposely vague definition of terrorism. And understanding that there is no globally agreed definition of terrorism, what we see is states all engaged in a practice of naming whatever they wish in that box, and no one calls them out on it, because it's the perfect gentleman's agreement where no one ever calls anybody else out on their use of the term terrorism. And under that mantle of permissiveness, what we see is the crux of terrorist activity, the actual acts of terrorism, in often ways obscured from a broader set of regulations, which have little to do with the actual commission of violence or physical harm. But what we see is states engaging in the criminalization of catch-all activities, which include in many cases, mere criticism of the government or engaging with UN actors to talk about what's happening in their own domestic context. More than that, what I also see is a move into pre-criminal space, the criminalizations of things that are not yet done, including expression, association, and simply engaging with others in political affairs. In a parallel to all of this, as well as in the counterterrorism range, we are also seeing the use of the language of extremism to target civil society, so that criticism of government, expression of different views becomes extremist from states' perspectives. And what's happened, and I think many of us know that it's not just about definitions, it's not just about the law. These regulatory practices are coupled with the enhanced use of surveillance powers. We've certainly seen that for organizations who've been subject to the use of those surveillance technologies, interfering with the most intimate parts of a person's life, not just with the work that they do. On top of that, what we see the increased use of secret or classified evidence and the limitation on fair trials and fair procedures. And all of that is bundled together with the use of extended penalties for all of these crimes. In many cases, in many countries, lifetime imprisonment, as well as asset seizure. And all of those not only impact the persons who are directly targeted, but their families and communities in deep and profound ways. And all of this is coinciding with the strictures, the choking, the limitations on civil society that are happening in almost every country on this planet. They include NPO laws with regulations that not are intended to ensure the functioning, the ability, the breathing of civil society, but are all about placing burdens and limitations and stops on the capacity of civil society to function effectively. Everything from exorbitant fees to burdensome requirements of reporting to the reporting of every financial transaction an NGO engages in. What all of this is doing is silencing human rights defenders, and it's disincentivizing the risks for those to engage, for all of you and many others, to engage in work that is human rights based, because the costs are so high. We've seen those costs today on this panel, not only for all of you who've directly experienced these challenges, but for your families, the ways in which the communities you function in, your families, your wives, your children, your mothers, your fathers, your daughters, your sons, all of you bear the burden of what it means to do human rights work. So let me be very clear from the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. The abuse of counterterrorism measures to target human rights defenders and civil society is absolutely unacceptable. And it's not just morally unacceptable, but it violates international law. And it is precisely intended to weaken the international rule of law. And it also works against our security and our safety, because when you target civil society, you target the best of us. I think it's important to say, and we have, I think, clearly documented without fear or favor, that respect for international human rights treaties and norms is mutually reinforcing for advancing security. Security is a human right, but we have to advance security with and holding human rights in our hands. And it is a vibrant and enabling environment for engaging with civil society that will fundamentally make us all safe in the long run. So let me conclude with 3 recommendations to member states and other stakeholders who are with us today. First of all, I, as Special Rapporteur, urge member states to protect the full range of fair trial and due process rights as required by international human rights law to any individuals who is detained, including in pretrial detention, and subject to prosecutions and other sanctions under counterterrorism law and regulations. Second, I urge all member states and stakeholders to affirm and reaffirm the precise definition of terrorism as adopted by UN Security Council Resolution 1566, and to take into account the model definition of terrorism offered by my mandate to ensure that we do not have laws in the counterterrorism arena that exceed their proper scope. And I call on you to rescind laws or regulations that criminalize the charge of extremism without any qualifications. Finally and thirdly, all of us, and I include special procedure mandate holders and the brave work of human rights organizations, all of us play this role in documenting and shedding light on the misuse and abuse of counterterrorism measures to target human rights defenders and civil society organizations. We need independent oversight, monitoring, and evaluation of national counterterrorism programs and policy, including in the capacity building and technical support that the UN itself provides to states engaged in counterterrorism. It also requires us to unflinchingly and without hesitation call out states for human rights light and civil society absent approaches to counterterrorism, even our friends and allies who don't do this well either, underscore how unproductive these approaches are. And finally, it requires us to show solidarity, because human rights defenders stand bravely and often alone in the face of the overwhelming nature of state power exercised against them. And so I'm thankful to be here with you today and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I would like to thank the speakers for their invaluable contributions and testimonies. I will give the floor back to our speakers to answer the following questions received. Why does international pressure work in certain cases and not in others? And what are the recommendations you have for states present today? And I will take the speakers by order of speaking. So Jamila, you have the floor.
Merci beaucoup à tous les intervenants.
Thank you so much. It's obvious that we need strong actions nationally and also internationally, where the institutions, where the Human Rights Commissariat and also the special rapporteurs to stop these anti-terror legislation, to silence civil society and human rights activists, which are threatened by these extreme legal provisions. And also, we need strong actions in order for us to get to freeing all the opinion prisoners and those who are on hunger strike, and to lead campaigns and to mobilize in order for them, because their lives are in danger. This is the main object, because those who are accused, they are threatened daily, and we fear for our lives and the lives of who are dear to us. And this is my recommendation to the special rapporteurs. I thank you. Thank you, Jamila.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Well, I wanted to add one small thing, which is, again, maybe that needs more work on it, but the major use of counterterrorism law for basic corruption. In Egypt, I've seen tens of businessmen, known of them the Sabit family or the Suirki family, who were arrested and thrown in jail as terrorists, basically to negotiate 51% of their companies. So the use of counterterrorism, not only as a way to control population or as a fear tactic or confiscating public space and hitting on human rights defenders, but also as a major source of corruption, both on a state base or as an individual base. Yes, in my case, I've got a wonderful campaign that was done by my wife, who attracted thousands of people from around the world, policymakers and parliamentarians, that led to an international pressure for my release, but that is definitely no way to release 60,000 Egyptian political prisoners. We need to break the wheel. We need to change the rules of the game. I, yes, definitely call and recommend that we call to cancel the co-chairing of Egypt for example, with the EU on the global counterterrorism platform, because Egypt is not an honest interlocutor on the counterterrorism. Two, I definitely call on you and on member states of the Human Rights Council in the UN to support the European Parliament and parliamentarians' statement calling for a monitoring body on Egypt's human rights situation. This is the only way to check the Egyptian government and keep it under pressure for the release of the 60,000 Egyptian prisoners. Thank you, and I think we need to raise our voice and keep our momentum, and this is the only way to face those atrocities done under the name of counterterrorism. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sayed, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I would echo what Ram stated, but I also would like to add, it's always the call for special rapporteurs to insist access to the country is always very important one. But the special rapporteurs alone, making these demands without backing of the states, renewing these things, I think it's not going to have a real effect. So we do need members of the states to remind those countries that they should allow engagement or allow access to special rapporteurs. I think as a second one, it will be the reminder of name and shame these countries when they call them out in front of everyone. And just even if this doesn't change their behavior a lot, but to keeping it on the record, it's also an important one. And the last is someone would ask about why one campaign would work and another would not campaign. I think usually the campaign act in itself is sometimes it could achieve the result, sometimes it doesn't. But what's really important is that when people do their best, that they send the solidarity message to the prisoner, to their family, even though it is not, they are not out. But there is one message which is there, is that they didn't let the state break their will, and they continue to be a real problem to the state. If they would know that their right every time it's abused, that it will have, but I would call it consequences. And it's really important that pressure, even if it didn't work, but it doesn't mean that the country is happy with it, especially if it is very strong. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Sahar, you have the floor.
Yes, I wanted to thank all my colleagues and echo their recommendations. And I totally agree with Rami that without a political will from especially the states, not just the Europeans, but in general, in order to enforce the respect of human rights against a state that systematically is violating human rights, we need a very strong political will to take measures. And in our context as Palestinians, definitely, for example, in our case as 6 designated organizations, with the other cases of human rights defenders, the EU should really stop just issuing statements or demanding from Israel to respect human rights. They can use the agreement, the commercial agreements with the Israelis in order to impose the respect of human rights via these tools that their own system developed. Why it's used in other contexts, but not and never with the Israeli state. Maybe I should thank also the special rapporteur for the message that was drafted jointly from the special rapporteurs in our behalf as organizations demanding from the European countries to take decision. Because, for example, being in this area, the gray area, without taking a clear decision that Israel should revoke their decision in our case, this is what enables Israel to continue in the harassment against our staff, against us as organizations in this case, which enabled them to arrest Salah Hamouri 2 days ago. And this is why it's very urgent that states should take concrete measures and not just condemnations.
Thank you. Special Rapporteur, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I think I've made some really concrete recommendations at the end of my remarks, but let me just say 2 other things. I think that at a global level, this problem is a systemic, entrenched, structural problem of the global misuse of counterterrorism. And it is facilitated and enabled by a global architecture and normative framework of counterterrorism that has emerged since 9/11. And unless we undo that architecture, and unless we call out the permissive space that has been created through the UN Security Council that enables states to hide behind the language of terrorism to attack civil society, we are only addressing this problem piecemeal. So we have enormous work to do, certainly in Geneva, but I would underscore the extent to which some of this work has to be done in the security spaces of New York. The second thing I would say is, in the context of the global counterterrorism strategy that was negotiated last year, we've seen significant gains and a recognition by many states, including a range of diverse states, that actually the attacks on civil society are counterproductive. They're not helping, and they're certainly making things much worse. They're contributing to a global problem of authoritarianism and backsliding democracy, and they're part of the systemic global challenge that we're facing in the context of the weakening of the multilateral system. So this isn't just a case-by-case country issue, and it's all of the individual countries are significant and important, but it's a massive global problem. And the third thing I think we're seeing, and for example, I think we're seeing it increasingly in some of in the traditional counterterrorism spaces, including, for example, the FATF, the Office of Counterterrorism and UNCTED and other bodies, that they are increasingly understanding the negative effects that this has on the really clear risks of terrorism that do exist in certain states and certain countries. And so that recognition that actually this is profoundly counterproductive, and that only when we call out what is happening at a national level are we going to solve the global challenges that we face, are we going to make progress. And I think the other thing that I would just underscore here is that all of you, all of the organizations we see and all of the individuals here, you may not feel like your voices are heard, but they are actually permeating through. And part of the reason that this conversation is so live, whether it's in the US Congress or in the FATF project on unintended consequences or in the Global Counterterrorism Strategy Review, is this conversation is moving out of human rights spaces into other spaces. And the reason that's happening is because your voices are being heard. And I think that's the message of, in some ways, it's not just a message of solidarity, but it's a message of saying you make a difference. Because if we are doing this work and we don't feel we're making a difference, we're stuck in an unending cycle. But I honestly and positively say that the space I see us in, and it is extremely difficult and some days extremely dark, but nonetheless, the words you say, the things you describe, the challenges you face are being heard. And that's our challenge, is to translate the hearing into concrete actions and an end to the systematic misuse of counterterrorism measures across multiple countries, multiple regions, and within the UN system. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to all our speakers. I would just like to reiterate the asks and urge member states to heed the recommendations provided by all speakers on how to deal with the destructive impacts of the counterterrorism laws and policies, including by firmly condemning the misuse of terrorism in the region, calling on states to drop all unfounded terrorism charges against organizations, human rights defenders, journalists, and peaceful political dissent, and proactively pressing for the release of those arbitrarily detained, including in their statements at the ongoing Human Rights Council session. States should also review their military and security cooperation to ensure that they do not in any way facilitate or contribute to human rights violations. At the UN level, governments who systematically misuse counterterrorism in the ways described today should not be given leading roles within the UN human rights counterterrorism framework, and efforts by such states to weaken international human rights standards within this area must be strongly opposed. I once again want to thank the public for staying with us, even if we were a little bit late, and thank the speakers for their testimonies and for their very strong and compelling calls for action by the international community. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
saura faire un communiqué.